Okay, great. Last session of the day now. Can I just check who did, how you approach the questions? Who did sort of questions, and who did a creative project, and who did a mixture of all four things?
We did a mixture.
You did a mixture of all lot?
We did none of the above.
You did a question, okay. Any other group want to tell us what they did? I was just going to bring the question people together and the project people together if it made sense, but if you've all done a mixture, we'll just do it 1 to 6. Okay, we'll do it 1 to 6, fine. Group 1? Group 1? Was that this? Yes, was that your group? Oh, okay. Who's 1?
Those guys were meeting over there.
Who's representing?
Well, I came along
Late, so you're ever getting more responses.
Festival?
Yeah, I was late too, but we just had a general conversation, which was building on the discussion with Lisa about her work and talking about this expanded field, which the technology in part makes available, plus the explosion of venues for actually using exhibition spaces almost as research publication in progress kind of opportunities. So, which is, one of the great effects perhaps of the loosening of, the hegemony on the art world and definitions of what is and isn't art. With new media art, there is now a possibility for outsiders to come in and find novel ways of publishing and disseminating their research and providing an opportunity to ask questions about the new conditions in which knowledge circulates. So that was one of the issues, I think. But following on from that, we had a little kind of conversation about the de-skilling of the professionally credentialed artists that entails. The one thing about that hegemony was it was incredibly exclusive and it was very difficult to break in. And so there are now lots, we're over, in a sense, we've always been overproducing artists, in terms of credentialing artists. And now they're going to find it even harder to sustain a professional career, even though there are more venues, both virtual and three-dimensional. The whole question of professional expertise and what we mean by art, which kind of dovetails, I think, with the question you raised about generic specificity or the different kinds of art. In a way, a documentary film is not a video essay, and they come out of different traditions and they have different audiences and different objectives and so on. So some of that specificity gets lost, but I think the gains are clearly there in terms of the democratization or opening up, at least, of creative modes of presentation and representation for new research on topics which, as Lisa points out, are often ignored or mystified in the corporate media. Any other?
Great. Is it Brandon? Are you elected spokesman for Group 2?
Is this on? Okay. So we kind of started out with a general conversation about, I guess, a pretty theoretical conversation about aesthetics and politics. And Doug kind of opened with the question as to say, well, if we look at some of the work that Lisa was presenting, as having an activist goal or initiative, what is the forum or who is the audience or what is the intended effect of this kind of politically driven work? And so that kind of generated or degenerated into a conversation about kind of the inherited notions we have of what political art practice is. And so on the one hand, we have this kind of inherited notion of having some kind of aesthetic experience and then going out and having a conversation or throwing stones at people or going to protest at City Hall. And then on the other hand, we were wondering, or I was wondering, I guess, as to why that's the only notion, or one of the only, a particular notion of political, and if we might have another notion, which is, some kind of other way in which we can envision the political that doesn't require direct action, and so maybe that would drive a lot of us to be a lot less pessimistic about the political potential of some of this type of art practice. Then we kind of moved and shifted toward the conceptualizing some kind of creative project, and we started thinking about how networks and infrastructure and how difficult it would be to, in this day and age, escape completely and disappear. So we kind of came up with 4 scenarios: the murderer who kills someone at a Safeway, the adultering spouse, the person who wants to escape with a motorcycle game to Montana, and what was the 4th one? Oh, right, the Amazonian tribe that decides they never want to be discovered, and so they disappear into the Amazon. And so our artistic/political intervention would be to kind of set up all these new media coverage of all of these things and see that were clandestine, so no one else knew that they were being covered, to see how long it would take for these different types of clandestine activities to be discovered or traced or found, to kind of unearth the networks that are already in place that have surveillance over all of us. Did I leave anything out? Oh, well, here you go.
Oh, that's okay.
I wanted to add one thing, and at the very end, I got to hear what they're all working on, and I just hope there's going to be a chance for everybody to even do nutshell summaries of what everybody's working on, because it seems like you guys should be doing presentations, and I'm sure, I know you've been talking amongst yourselves about what your research interests are and everything, but
you can pass it around, yeah. Well, first of all, we were unanimous, I think, in our appreciation for both Dick's and Lisa's talks today as being very provocative and exciting. We started off, and hopefully my group will correct me, I didn't even think we were going to be doing this, but we started off talking about what it means to be a non-expert in a technical field and then sort of working on that kind of a thing. And I think, Lisa, your work is it raises as many questions as it answers. And we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say tomorrow about in some more detail. Like, I didn't even realize cable ended, let alone, so that kind of stuff. Like, how do you know this? So one of the examples of somebody who, maybe an early person doing this was Elaine Scarry, when she started working on the black boxes in airplanes after the crashing of the TWA. And there was a lot of a debate about whether or not she was qualified to talk about this. And so the black box people might have felt like, no, not necessarily. But it raises then the question that artists and humanities people who want to work on these things can say things about these technologies and disrupt the boundaries and self-referential, especially around science, which is so incredibly self-referential. And then another thing among the many things we talked about were just some of our impressions of the films that you had showed. And so Alejandro was talking about, kind of the political message, and this comes back to what you guys were talking about, is how sort of the politics of certain kinds of information. And Alejandro was saying that many of his friends would not like the made in China one, because it kind of hammers you over the head, like that Americans should feel guilty. Which, of course, then we sort of talked about that Americans should feel guilty. But it was also, and then I could use it as my occasion to be like, Americans should be encouraged not to vote and stay home, and I'm like the deeply anti-populist position. But and then we were talking about the didacticism of Ursula's film and whether or not that's appealing, and then just saying that the Murakami work is very anti-didactic, and thank God Dick did a kind of didacticism so we could actually understand that it's not just about tits and cum, but about nuclear holocaust and other kinds of interesting things along those lines. And I'll just, are there other things from our group that I can't remember anything else?
Yeah, we talked about Wall-E. I wanted to mention that because we were making the comparison between Wall-E and some of the art projects and the two films that we saw, because, and this was kind of in relationship to the discussion about didacticism, because, you know, we were interested in troubling this idea or this kind of impression, suggestion that seemed to be coming up that, politically effective work needed to have a clear communicative, function. And that, so didacticism and the political kind of went together, and then the aesthetic and the apolitical were being put together on the other side. And obviously, we wouldn't want to reduce things that much. But so, Wall-E kind of gave us a lot of things to talk about in terms of the way that people have discussed the film up till now, and it's usually either about how, Americans really need to get this message, about environmental destruction, and then on the other hand, but it's so, beautiful and visually stunning, and as an aesthetic work, is, has a value in and of itself. So that was just something I wanted to add.
Well, it's like, I think one thing that we kind of talked about is this idea that, like the problem where you have like these privileged, Americans who should be meant to feel guilty, and then you have the poor oppressed people in China. But then we talked about things like who was cleaning up after Mardi Gras and that kind of thing, and sort of what about racialized poverty in New Orleans and that sort of thing, and so thinking that maybe it was too easy to say that all Americans are privileged and all Chinese are oppressed, so the film seemed to be suggesting that.
Okay. Anyone else from group 4? No? I think we're on.
Yeah. Okay, so we did a thought experiment that we thought was by way of answering the question number 1, Lisa's question number 1. What does the labor of the artist filmmaker entail? And it was based on I said that I wanted to show this film, Mardi Gras Made in China, to a class of Frosh students who take a mandatory class. It's 400 students. And it will be part of a series that I'm organizing on global discourse on globalization. 3 of the talks will be part of the Frosh class. And hopefully the other 3 talks will be attended by the same 400, but voluntarily. So the thought experiment was the following. I love the film, I said, but I said, how could I prevent my students from reaching what I take it to be the first almost mandatory American conclusion after seeing this film? I shouldn't buy from China. Because I didn't take, I don't personally, I said, I don't think that is a smart conclusion. And so fortunately for us, Nicole had actually taught the film a couple of times and used it. And so we had, I think, a very productive conversation about how could you avoid that? How could you, and so the way in which we proceeded was by saying, how could you make this film even better? So what we came up with was the following. Connected to regulation or lack thereof of working conditions. Connected to workers' access to political representation or lack thereof. Toby suggested that contrasting the reaction of the 2 African-American students who were having a great time and the MBA from Florida was a great way of contrasting a universal conception of human dignity and rights. The 2 black students, dude, this is wrong. Nobody should live like this. Versus the MBA, who was much more supply and demand, and this is all dependent on the contextual situation in China, and maybe for them this is a living wage. So that highlighting the contrast between these 2 positions within the film could go a long way toward expanding its power to avoid the easy conclusion. Then Nicole also suggested that the film could have spent time with the retailers, which did not spend any time with, like with Walmart. for example, the people who are actually selling this out to the consumer. Finally, and I think this was the creative part of our experiment, was to think what would this film look like if instead of trying to educate the American audience, the American consumer, about the global connections of their lifestyles and consumption patterns, the film had in mind a Chinese audience. And so we tried to imagine what would that film look like.
One answer to that question of what a film might look like that is perhaps doing or speaking to another audience or slightly more anyway, perhaps an overlapping audience. But David, you mentioned The World and that we'll watch. The director Jia Zhangke has a new documentary called Useless, which is a documentary about the fashion industry in China, about the international fashion industry in China and also the Chinese domestic fashion industry. And it really resists doing that kind of world systems like global exploitation, division of labour argument. It's very, very different to that and quite surprising. So, yeah, that's just one example. It's made for a film festival audience, but, you know, he's an important Chinese director and has some kind of claim to it. It's J-I-A, Zhang, so Jia Zhangke, J-I-A-Z-H-A-N-G-K-E. Thank you. Okay.
I don't have a lot of comments and responses. It's just interesting to hear people talking as a group about about these issues. I think this idea of taking an artwork or a film and asking how it could be better is a really useful exercise. And I always think about Constance Penley's work when things like this happen, because she always reminds me that the most that if you like a work, you can be the most passionate critic, right? A fan of something is the most, sometimes harsh, but most passionate and rigorous critic. So the fact that the film triggered the desire to think about what other forms it might take, what other audiences it might be addressed to, I think speaks a little bit to a modicum of success of the project in terms of, and I guess this connects to the other point that was raised back here about this film Wall-E and about the issue of political art and didacticism versus more minimalist aesthetic art and politics. And I guess I'm very open-minded about the different ways in which art might be political, and I didn't mean to suggest at all in showing these films that this was the appropriate path. I only just thought that they would generate interesting discussion, and some of the most political work is minimalist and subtle to the point where you don't even it's hard to articulate what's political about it, but in some sensual, intuitive way that it's significant. So I think that's really all I have to say. And I really want to hear more from all of you what you're working on and what your interests are as well, and how you guys as the next generation of scholars will define and think about this field that we're calling creative industries, and how you want the constellations that you'd like to see it form into, or directions you would like to move, direct it into. So, I guess I also, when I was hearing people talk about their work, I'm happy to talk tomorrow, but I'm also can share my space or yield the floor if other people want to, we could turn it into shorter presentations if people have burning desire to present their work and get feedback. It's great to have this kind of a context and venue and people to engage with your work. It's really great. So I think that's all.
I think we have a volunteer at the back already. Sorry, Gina.
So I think we took from the question of the ethics of authorship and started to think about the two films that you showed and methodology. The question of methodology was the one that we talked a lot about what a lot of you brought up, but the question of methodology in the sense that what happens when people are doing things in fields that they're not experts or trained in. And so this question yielded to, let's say, just a couple of examples from both films. So in the Made in China film, it seemed to a lot of the people in my group anyway that the foregone conclusion was that the Americans were going to feel guilty, and then we already expected what the conclusion would be. But what was the most exciting part for us was the little inscription at the end that said, "Oh, this girl left the factory, and then this girl left the factory. These 3 girls left the factory." And like, if you were an ethnographer, you would have to somehow answer to that fact, because we were talking about how in the translation of these people, and I'm sure this David Redman, he did not speak Chinese because he had a Chinese woman interviewing these girls, and she seemed to have a natural dialogue with them, which I'm not sure how much he, as the documentarian, understood. And so these kinds of new subjectivities that are created, I think an ethnographer would have to account for that. Whereas in this particular case, we're not really sure how he didn't deal with it. And also the factory manager, like, yeah, for everything that he was, evil, corrupt, or whatever judgments you had on the person, it seemed like there was something lost in translation, because he was speaking English, but it's not his first language, and also the terms in which he was discussing the work that he did wasn't something that I think, or a lot of people in my group thought, didn't capture his position also. In the other film with Ursula Bleeman, the image of her insinuating herself by sitting in a desk, you know, the whole split image of the video screen and showing the landscape of the topic that she's investigating was very great for us to understand that she's being very self-reflexive and inserting her voice. At the same time, Sahana, you're talking about how the interview with the prostitutes, there was an absolutely palpable tension in the air where the women were very uncomfortable, and these pimps were like interlocutors, and somebody said that it was an act of violence against these women, it seemed. And so there are these kinds of issues that, if trained in ethnography, you would definitely have to work this out. But as artists come, academics come, whatever, social commentator, activist, media essayist, these issues, who do we turn to? So then we started thinking about the standards of how we, standards of how we are to judge. Like, is there a peer-to-peer review for these kinds of artists? Or, on the other case, academics come artists. So academics who do artwork, like Lisa. But I gave another example of a woman in, Svetlana Boehm is a woman at Harvard who wrote this book called The Future of Nostalgia, and she goes and talks about her past, and she takes all these pictures when she first goes back to her home place after the Soviet Union is broken apart, and she presented her work as a photojournalist at a Harvard gallery. And so, there's this question of how we're to negotiate the kind of things that we are able to do by the conditions that allow us to produce this kind of work, and is that somehow explicit in the work itself. And when it's not, then you have a case like, for example, a tenure faculty member at a university that's in a very well-established university in the Midwest that I brought up. I'm not going to name names, but basically he's an artist who had an art practice and he just produced a film made a film documentary called Koryo Saram, which is about Kazakh Koreans in Kazakhstan. And it was a project that was 12 years in limbo, and he got the interest of a professor who produced his entire film and then hired him and then gave him tenure, and he didn't even have an MFA at that point. So, I mean, there's a whole set of standards and ethics and procedure that is somehow foregone or bygone conclusion. And so I think Sana gave this question that ended our discussion by saying, do the creative industries create creative shortcuts for tenure? So that was, in a nutshell, our very good discussion.
Thank you very much for that. I'm sorry for missing you the first time. Do you want to say anything else? Or? Okay, thank you all very much. Yes, you do.
I think you raise a lot of really important points there. But I also think it's really important not to idealize pure communication and to realize that sometimes acts of mistranslation, miscommunication, inarticulation lead to much more interesting forms of communication, and that it's really important to think meticulously and carefully about research design when you're thinking about methodology. But it's never perfect in the end. And I mean, sometimes the mistakes and the trip-ups are the most interesting parts. And I don't mean to idealize the other side of what you're saying, but I just think we have to resist the idea of perfect and pure communication, translation, and knowledge production. And I mean, this is where the work of Haraway is always, I love her stuff about, you know, the impartiality of knowledge, or the partiality and impartiality of knowledge. And anyway, that's how I would respond, but thank you for the very detailed comments that you guys came up with. It's great.